We saw the losses in Allied air fleets by watching the formations take off and return with great gaps in them, after bombing missions, he said. You know these things, but they wouldn't report them in the press. And in the papers there were the caricatures of the Nazis, which led him to question official truths. There was a magazine at that time, rather like Life, but in England called The Picture Post, and every issue had a caricature box, rather like Doonesbury, that kind of layout, and it was called Arthur Ferrier's Searchlight, a box of various little caricatures, usually dominated by the Nazi figures. There was fat old Goering and Hitler with his postman's hat, and there was Dr. Goebbels, who was shorter and had one leg shorter. And it seemed to me at that time, as a youngster, there was something odd in the fact that these cartoon characters were able to inflict so much indignity and deprivation on an entire country like ours. I said to myself, if they're such ludicrous people, then why are the Germans doing it for them? It's interesting that Irving raises the same objection here to the caricature Hitler as Trevor Roper does to the pawn and mountebank theories. Such a diminished figure can't bridge the abyss between Hitler's apparent petty criminal character and the unimaginable magnitude of the crimes he did perpetrate, the power of the spell he casts over the German people. And so, Irving continues, I began to be skeptical, and emerging from university rather footloose and feckless with no particular aim, I became a steel worker in Germany, to help me learn the language. Then finding out about Dresden, which at that time was totally unknown in the outside world. Nobody had ever heard of the Dresden air raid, he says, exaggerating somewhat. And I wrote a book on the Dresden air raid, The Destruction of Dresden, which imported Dresden into the vocabulary of war atrocities. People now speak about Hiroshima, Auschwitz, and Dresden, and that's thanks to me. So I decided to be a writer. And I went to my publisher, and he said, "What are you going to write next?" And I said, "I've decided to pick Adolf Hitler." And he said, "Well, there have been lots of books about Hitler. How are you going to justify yours?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to tell it from the inside, the way I did with the Dresden book." You couldn't get access to the Air Ministry records of the Dresden raid, so I circumvented that by advertising in the newspapers in Germany and in Britain and America for people who had taken part on one end or another of the air raid. And I'll do the same with Hitler. I'll spend 5 years interviewing all the Hitler people. At this point, Irving's wife, Susie, a young woman from Denmark, entered and asked if we'd like tea or coffee. After we made our requests, Irving returned to the story of how he got entree to the magic circle. In return for collecting documents for the archivist of the Munich Institute for Contemporary History, Dr. Anton Hock, Hock gave me a lot of help identifying to me the important people and all the addresses of Hitler's private staff, who at that time kept their heads very, very low. They kept down. They were a small circle of very frightened people who were putting up with grave indignities and who had a very tough time. Christa Schroeder, Hitler's secretary, had been held in prison by the Americans for 3 or 4 years, and that's a very unpleasant experience for a young girl. It's remarkable how easily Irving's sympathies are aroused for a young woman who spends 3 or 4 years in an American prison, and yet he can appear so unmoved by the hundreds of thousands of young women who died in concentration camps. But Christa Schroeder was the key to the magic circle. He pursued Christa Schroeder like a suitor. Even with her, it took me a couple of years to get through her front door. It took a lot of patience. But the entree to the circle, the Hitler circle, was when I translated the memoirs of Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who was the head of the German High Command and hanged at Nuremberg. He tracked down the Field Marshal's son and asked him about ellipses and omissions in the published versions of his memoirs. And he obviously valued the fact that I had taken this trouble to do that, because he was indignant at what the German publishers had done to this book. And because I'd taken that trouble, on the second occasion I visited him, in about 1967, he said, "If you like, I will introduce you to Otto Gunsche." Still alive. The only one of Hitler's adjutants still alive, living near Cologne. His significance was that he was the SS adjutant on Hitler's staff who burned his body at the end. That's where he comes in. He was Hitler's most faithful bulldog, and he has never spoken to anybody except me. I got 10 hours of recordings of Gunsche, which he's never given to anybody else. With Gunsche, Irving was at last home free. That was the entrance to the magic circle. It was a magic circle. They met at the graveside. When one of them left, his curiously euphemistic word for dying, they would meet at the graveside, and to get into that magic circle was almost impossible. Irving lost no time exploiting his entree. Having got into the ring, the next problem is winning their confidence. They had stories to tell, and a lot of them had private papers. This wasn't so easy, but half the battle was won because I was the Englishman who had written the book on the Dresden air raids that was, by this time, a big bestseller in Germany. While it's undoubtedly true that part of the success of the Dresden book was attributable to the way it helped buttress a moral equivalence slaughter on both sides complacency in post-war Germany, I was surprised to discover that Irving didn't encourage this view at the time he wrote his Dresden book. In fact, in the last sentence of the book, Irving calls Dresden a massacre carried out in the cause of bringing to their knees a people who, corrupted by Nazism, had committed the greatest crimes against humanity in recorded time. But the more time Irving spent with the magic circle, the less he seemed to focus on these greatest crimes in recorded time, the more he seemed to succumb to the spell. Irving describes himself as laboring to gain the confidence of the magic circle, but another kind of confidence game seemed to be at work, one in which Irving was, if not conned, then taken so far inside their confidence, so far inside the magic circle, that he could no longer look at it from without. Within the charmed circle, the Hitler spell still held sway, and Irving had fallen victim to it. I was talking to these people in 67, 68, and 69. I carried out major interviews with all these people on tape. I went into enormous detail with them. And what struck me very early on is that you're dealing with people who are educated people. Hitler had attracted a garniture of high-level educated people around him. The secretaries were top-flight secretaries. The adjutants were people who had gone through university or through staff college and had risen through their own abilities to the upper levels of the military service. So they were educated people with insight. I recall wondering at the time where this praise of the Magic Circle's resumes was leading. I didn't have long to wait. This is the point. These people, without exception, spoke well of him. Coming as I did with an as-yet unpainted canvas, this was really the seminal point, the seminal experience, to find 25 people of education, all of whom privately spoke well of him. Once they'd won your confidence and they knew that you weren't going to go and report them to the state prosecutor, they trusted you. And they thought, well, now at last they were doing their chief a service. I believe Freudian slips are often overrated as tools of analysis. Nonetheless, Irving's slip here, once they'd won your confidence, when clearly in the context he means once you'd won their confidence, gives away the true nature of the confidence game going on. Irving's reasoning is fairly suspect on several other counts. First, his claim that he approached his magic circle sources with an as-yet unpainted canvas is unconvincing. Unpainted, perhaps, but not uncolored by that time. More important, his claim to have been thunderstruck that people with excellent resumes still spoke highly of Hitler should scarcely come as a revelation. He also tells me, without a trace of irony, that they told him Hitler was well loved by children and dogs. More important than their degree of education in shaping their post-war view is their degree of association with Hitler. It serves their own self-image far better if the Hitler they present to the world, the Hitler they served so faithfully, is the congenial, gemütlich host of the post-midnight dinner parties, rather than the mass murderer of millions. All that happened outside the bunker, outside the magic circle's purview. But Irving still maintains he was just absolutely astonished to find all this goodwill from the secretaries and flunkies. That's what convinced me that obviously there was a book to be written here, that there were two Adolf Hitlers. There was the Adolf Hitler of Madison Avenue and Hollywood, and there was the Adolf Hitler that these people had experienced in flesh and blood. That he was a walking, talking, ordinary human being with bad breath and largely false teeth. What's false here is not just Hitler's teeth, but the way Irving defines the two Hitlers. The true, flesh and blood, impressive to top-notch secretaries Hitler, and the false Hitler of Madison Avenue and Hollywood, as if the flesh and blood of the 50 million casualties of Hitler's war were an invention of Hollywood and Madison Avenue. A better description of the other Hitler would be not the Hollywood and Madison Avenue, but the Dachau and Auschwitz Hitler. The disingenuousness of this attitude inheres in the allusion to Hitler's bad breath, in the pretense that Irving is no slavish hero worshipper, but capable of seeing the unvarnished truth about Hitler's flaws. Not the mass murder, of course, but the poor oral hygiene. Here again the question arose, can Irving believe in the false logic of the two Hitler argument? Has he convinced himself of it? Or is he a cynical manipulator, a mountebank? The Bullock versus Trevor Roper debate again, here not about Hitler, but about the thought world of his chief post-war defender. It was at this point that Irving told me a Hitler story I'll never forget, one that may go further to explain him, and perhaps Hitler, than any I'd heard. It's a story he heard from the woman who was his key to the magic circle, Christa Schroeder, a story about Hitler washing blood off himself. I was talking with Christa Schroeder one morning about 2 or 3 a.m. over a bottle of wine, and she says, "You know, Hitler, could be quite cruel. I don't think you're right about Hitler's Jewish problem. He could be very cruel." You sensed a story coming on. Now, the problem with Christa Schroeder was I couldn't take notes. If she saw a piece of paper come out, she would clam right up. I had to go straight round to a cafe and download my brain onto a sheet of paper for hours. You can discipline yourself to do that, Irving tells me. And she said, "Well, you remember the night of the long knives in June 1934? I was in Berlin, and the chief, which she called him, or A.H., phoned me and said I had to go to the Rhineland immediately to join him. Something had come up. And I flew over to the Rhineland, and Dr. Goebbels was there. On our way to the chief, we flew down to Munich that same night, and we drove out in his car up to Bad Weissei, and I was with him when he arrested Ernst Röhm and all the SA leaders. And I was with him when he drove back, and I remember how impressed I was that on the way back he personally got out of this big supercharger and stopped the oncoming cars of the other SA generals, and had them arrested too, and no concern with the risk that he was taking. Anyway, at the end of all this bloody day, when they were going to take them up to prison to be shot, we flew back to Berlin, and I'd lost sight of Hitler in the chancellery for a while. And I went to the cafeteria, and I got myself, you know, it was quite late, but he joined me because we were both vegetarians. He came in an hour later, stood in the doorway, and he says, "So, Fraulein Schroeder, now I have had a bath, and I am as clean as a newborn babe again." Clean as a newborn babe, meaning from the blood? I asked Irving. That's right. It jangled around her brain for 40 years until she found an Englishman she could repeat it to. And why did she find that particularly cruel? She found it symptomatic of the facility with which he committed mass murder. Irving says matter-of-factly that he just had to have a bath and was as clean as a newborn baby. He leaves it behind in "Went down the plug hole," Irving assents enthusiastically. "Like the blood in Psycho." This is an astonishing story, but one I'm inclined to credit, despite its source, because it certainly does Hitler no credit. I'm not quite sure what Irving makes of this story, but I think it can be seen as a defining Hitler story, and a defining David Irving story. A defining Hitler story because it's an image of Hitler in effect brandishing his own baby picture, pronouncing himself clean as a newborn babe, and just as innocent in an utterly meretricious and almost knowingly meretricious way. Enjoying, laughing at the notion of himself as an innocent babe. Brandishing his baby picture to forge a counterfeit image of innocence, as the blood, the first trickle of oceans to come, spirals down the plug hole like the blood in Psycho. And it's a defining David Irving story because he's made it his mission to wash the blood off Hitler's image, to restore him to history as a relative innocent, certainly one innocent of the blood of genocide. Irving doesn't use the image of washing blood off and newborn babes, but he does use the rhetoric of cleansing. Stone cleaning, he calls it. One can trace his evolution from respected amateur historian to sporadic Holocaust denier in the way he redefines stone cleaning from erasing grime to erasing crime. The stone cleaning image came up when I asked Irving if his sympathetic attitude toward Hitler might be a reflection of his captivation, if not captivity, by the magic circle. Is it possible there's a kind of Stockholm syndrome going on? I asked him. He professed himself unfamiliar with the phrase. I explained its origin in the report of a Swedish bank robbery that turned into a prolonged siege, after which hostages held by the robbers emerged from captivity, speaking remarkably sympathetically of their captors. In the same way, did they, the magic circle, gain your sympathy and— "Oh, undoubtedly," he said without hesitation. "Every time I've written a biography, you find you become close to the character you're writing about because you're his ambassador then. You're his ambassador to the afterlife, or to the next generation, and if you do your job conscientiously, then you bend over backward to do it." After a pause, he adds, "I don't think it should lead you to adapt an unobjective position, although it's hard to see how being Adolf Hitler's self-anointed ambassador to the afterlife conduces to objectivity. I think that people who say I'm whitewashing Hitler," he continues, "or that I'm a Hitler apologist, these words I find deeply offensive. I'm stone cleaning, not whitewashing." Stone cleaning? Cleaning dirt off. It's an English expression which, he says, came into use after the limitations on sulphurous coal burning cleaned up London's grime-affixing smog. The buildings are being cleansed of sulphuric grime, he tells me. Similarly, with Hitler, he says, there's been a lot of slime poured over him, both during and after the war. For Irving, however, stone cleaning has meant far more than that. The turning point in the evolution of his views on the question of gas chambers and the extermination came in 1988, he tells me. Until then, he'd always adhered to the line that Hitler hadn't ordered extermination by gas. Then he came to question whether there had been any extermination or gassing at all. The occasion was the 1988 trial of Canadian Holocaust denier Ernst Zundel. Irving had come to testify there had been no Führer order. But I was shown the reports on the tests on the walls of the gas chambers at Auschwitz. These were tests performed 45 years after the fact by America's self-proclaimed electric chair expert, Fred Leuchter, an engineer rather than a chemist, and I became quite satisfied, having studied forensic chemistry at university, that this is an exact science and that there's no traces of cyanide compounds in the walls of those gas chambers. That was enough to convince him. That was the turning point for me. That's when we decided we had to cut the word gas chamber out of my book. Irving says he doesn't regard myself as a revisionist because I'm not a Holocaust specialist. But he seems happy to take credit for the recent high visibility of revisionism, arguing that his claim in Hitler's War that an absence of a written Führer order for extermination became the basis for a revisionist view which denied that the killing process ever happened. So what started out as a historical footnote in my Hitler's War in 1977 has now become so important that prime ministers and presidents have to denounce it, he says proudly. He's proud, but surprisingly, he's also somewhat ashamed. Ashamed, at least, of some of the company he keeps in the revisionist camp. Let me ask you about that, I said. You know, historians often speak of you as someone who's dug up a remarkable number of important documents, speak of that with great respect, but then they say, "Pity he flipped?" He asked me, almost plaintively. Well, they probably do say that in one way or another, but aren't you uncomfortable with the kind of people who are drawn to support you, many of whom are not interested in evaluating this objectively, but are flat-out anti-Semites who would— "Yes," he began, as our voices overlapped, "would, if there was no final solution, have wanted one anyway?" To my astonishment, he said, "You're absolutely right. The word uncomfortable, I think, is an understatement. I find it odious to be in the same company as these people. There is no question that there are certain organizations that propagate these theories which are cracked anti-Semites." He then proceeds to make another amazing assertion. He's only using these cracked anti-Semites cynically. He plans to jettison them as soon as he can find more respectable forums. "What else can I do?" he said, but speak at the gatherings of these cracked anti-Semites for the moment. "If I've been denied a platform worldwide, where else can I make my voice heard? As soon as I get back onto regular debating platforms, I shall shake off this ill-fitting shoe which I'm standing on at present. I'm not blind. I know these people have done me a lot of damage, a lot of harm, because I get associated then with those stupid actions." Fascinating. Association with cracked anti-Semites, experienced by Irving as the minor discomfort of ill-fitting footwear. Fascinating as well his candor, if that's what it was, about the manipulation he claims to be practicing upon the cracked anti-Semite allies he plans to discard like an ill-fitting shoe. He'll use them, these vile true believers, use them, manipulate them to give him a platform for his views, and then, when he, it's not clear how, becomes respectable again, he'll drop them. Why did this somehow remind me of a certain historical figure proclaiming himself clean as a newborn babe again? Perhaps it's the assumption that the taint of whipping up the cracked anti-Semites will all wash off, presumably just like the blood spiraling down the plug hole in Psycho. I must admit I found Irving's reasoning difficult to take seriously. It didn't make sense either as cynical, calculating opportunism — it seemed too pitifully transparent and inept to succeed — or as genuine, heartfelt rationalization of his behavior. I could not even find a Bullock-like synthesis of calculation and sincerity to make this argument seem coherent, especially, or because, he was confiding it to one of the traditional enemy. Traditional enemy is Irving's name for Jews in his Action Report newsletters, which seem to cater to his temporary cracked anti-Semite allies and Holocaust deniers. Therein, one can find reports from enthusiastic home experimenter Holocaust deniers on their scientific experiments, in which, for instance, they subject chickens and rabbits to diesel exhaust gas in an attempt to disprove the possibility that such gases were used to kill Jews. Similarly, Irving's stance in relation to Holocaust denial has seemed to waver confusingly back and forth in the time since I encountered him in his supposed moment of truth deliberation over the Eichmann-Führer order revelation. In his controversial 1996 biography of Goebbels, which he was hard at work on when I spoke to him, Irving seems to argue that the Holocaust, or at least mass killings of Jews, did happen, but that it was the evil Goebbels who was more responsible than Hitler, still virtually innocent as a newborn babe of that blood, or at least of deliberate killing, of premeditation. That was the position he maintained when he spoke to me, that there was some deliberate killing of Jews, perhaps 100,000 or so, but mainly wildcat, unauthorized actions in the blood heat of the fighting on the Eastern Front. And as for the concentration camps, they were really there for concentration, not killing. It's a position he seems to hold in the somewhat schizoid biography of Goebbels. There was a systematic effort to eliminate Jews, but Auschwitz was not a place specifically designed to gas and kill, merely the most brutal of all Himmler's slave labor camps and the one with the highest mortality rate. What happened in the camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka, he told me, was not murder except in the kind of generic sense that people were sent to camps where it was likely they would die of starvation and disease. Generic murder might qualify as one of the great evasive euphemisms of the late 20th century. Irving makes it sound somehow less culpable than real murder, although its victims are just as dead. There was a climate of hatred, he concedes, against Jews. There was an atmosphere of brutality and mass murder on the Eastern Front, an atmosphere whose origin he prefers to attribute to Allied bombing raids on the German homeland. As a result of the atmosphere, there might have been 100,000 or so Jews killed there in spontaneous outbreaks by troops on the Eastern Front. You wouldn't apply the word criminal to even 100,000, or evil? Unquestionably a criminal action, he said. But the criminal action, to my mind, wasn't genocide. He finds an even more peculiar rationale for distinguishing the murder of Jews, even hundreds of thousands, from actual genocide. To my mind, the crime wasn't killing Jews. The crime was killing innocent Jews. And it was the innocence that made it a crime, rather than their Jewishness that made it a crime. But this is what the word genocide is meant to blanket out. Because as soon as you abandon the word genocide and call it innocenticide instead, the Jewish community would oppose that. I must admit, with the introduction of the incenticide concept, I lost the ability to fathom what Irving was talking about. I tried to get past the semantics of generic murder and innocenticide. Setting aside the name genocide, I began. The criminality is beyond doubt, he concedes. These are innocent people being killed. And I even take it one step further than a lot of people. Presumably, he means a lot of people in the revisionist camps, or a lot of his crackpot anti-Semite followers. If somebody's put in a camp where they're likely to die of typhus, this too is a crime, even though what happened to people who died isn't prima facie murder. Anne Frank died of typhus. She wasn't murdered, but it's still a crime. And if I'm writing a book about Adolf Hitler, I still have to absolve him of that particular crime. Because it wasn't, premeditated. Any more than the killing of all the people who died of starvation in Buchenwald wasn't premeditated at the end of the war. Emaciated corpses that television loves to show us. This wasn't premeditated. Hitler didn't go around saying, "Okay, let's emaciate these guys." But didn't how these guys got there to die in the first place have something to do with Adolf Hitler? I found myself fascinated by the kind of hair-splitting Irving indulged in, always with the aim of cleansing the blood from Hitler. It was somehow important to absolve Hitler of the charge of murder in Anne Frank's death from typhus, even though if typhus hadn't gotten her, one of Hitler's crematoriums would have. It was, ultimately, horrifying. It was like watching the Hitler spell in action as Irving tied himself in knots, making a magic circle around the absent figure of the perpetrator, the Hitler he wants to envision clean as a newborn babe. I tried one final time. I quoted Irving's own words to him from something he'd written in the introduction to Hitler's War. If this biography were simply a history of the rise and fall of Hitler's Reich, it would be legitimate to conclude Hitler killed the Jews. He, after all, created the atmosphere of hatred with his speeches, which, even though never explicit, left the clear impression that liquidate was what he meant. "Exactly what I said to you today," Irving told me. But is there a practical difference between creating the atmosphere for extermination and leaving the clear impression he wanted liquidation? "Oh, I think a court can find the difference," he said cheerfully. "A moral difference, though?" "It would be rather like killing somebody by negligence," he said. Hitler was negligent in not realizing that this would be the outcome of his speeches. That would be one way of looking at it. Holocaust by negligence. Extermination as unintended consequence. A big oops by the newborn babe. Part 6. The War over the Question Why. An inquiry into the obscenity of understanding. Chapter 13. A Tale of Three Kafkas. A Cautionary Parable. In which the perils of pressing a Hitler explanation too far are explored, with a professor haunted by the descendants of Franz Kafka. Kafka moved in for the kill. Kafka will not give up. And I said to George, "Can't you stop Kafka?" Kafka will get you if it takes his last dying breath. Gazing at these lines I copied out of the transcript of my interview with Professor Rudolf Binion, it occurred to me that Kafka didn't just haunt the story of Binion's Hitler explanation, he stalked it. In addition to the real Franz Kafka and a mysterious lodger in Hitler's Munich apartment named Kafka, the story features a relative of Kafka who was Hitler's mother's doctor, a friend of Kafka who rescued the story of Hitler's mysterious nerve doctor from oblivion, and a distinguished American psychoanalyst named Kafka, also a distant relative of Franz, who has become, in Binion's mind at least, the academic equivalent of a stalker. A Kafka who's been hounding Binion and his supporters at scholarly conclaves, relentlessly seeking to discredit Binion's Hitler theory, Binion's claim to have discovered, in the coded casebook of Hitler's mother's Jewish doctor, the secret source of Hitler's anti-Semitism. Or, to put it in more Kafkaesque terms, the source of Hitler's metamorphosis. The mystery of Hitler's metamorphosis was what attracted Binion to Hitler studies in the first place. A promising young historian with a doctorate from Columbia, a professorship at Brandeis, and 2 well-received books, Defeated Leaders, a study of 3 failed politicians of the Third French Republic, and Frau Lou, a biography of Vienna's modernist muse, Lou Andreas Salome, Binion was casting about for a new subject to tackle when he came upon Bradley Smith's 1967 study of Hitler's childhood. It should be noted that this is Professor Bradley F. Smith. To the professor's dismay, the 80s saw the emergence of a Holocaust denier revisionist named Bradley R. Smith. Binion had much respect for Smith's book on the young Hitler, but it also served to emphasize to him that something, the seed of metamorphosis, was still missing. Smith says this young Hitler just isn't the man that we know as the fulminating Führer, who's always spewing out hate and rage and so on. He's just another guy. He's sort of likable. And something must have happened to him. I thought, something must have happened. Binion is recounting for me the journey he embarked upon in search of that something during lunch at a deli in Brookline, Massachusetts, called Pick-a-Chick. Binion left Hitler behind long ago. His book, Hitler Among the Germans, was published in 1976 to respectful reviews in the New York Times Book Review and the New York Review of Books. Although, as he put it, you never really leave Hitler behind. And in a sense, Hitler has not left him behind. Binion's most recent work, Love Beyond Death, a study of the eroticizing of death in post-Enlightenment European culture, led him to his own highly fraught encounter with love and death. He'd fallen in love with the graduate student researching Love Beyond Death with him, a woman who was at the time suffering, in a haunting irony, from the very condition, metastasized breast cancer, that was at the heart of his Hitler explanation. The two became involved at a time when Binion himself was being treated for lymphatic cancer. He recovered, she died, and the harrowing emotions he experienced have found a place in a long verse play he's written called The Patient, a floppy disk copy of which he handed me at his apartment before we headed out to Pick-a-Chick. And Hitler has not left him behind in another sense. Binion's archenemy Kafka, the descendant of Franz, continues to wage unceasing war on his Hitler theory, forcing Binion to return to Hitler again and again to defend his thesis against Kafka's attack. The recurrence of linkages of one sort or another between Hitler and Kafka throughout Hitler studies is rather remarkable and controversial. In addition to the D.M. Thomas character's conjecture about the kinship of Kafka and Hitler as artists of the unthinkable and the unbearable, many have invoked Kafka as a prophet, seen the absurd logic of the death camps foreshadowed in the Penal Colony and The Trial, and wondered whether only a Kafkaesque universe can explain the nightmare world Hitler made flesh. So many that a kind of scholarly backlash against Kafka-Hitler linkages has emerged. Michael Andre Bernstein, author of Foregone Conclusions, has characterized the habit of reading Hitler intimations into Kafka as backshadowing, and Holocaust literature scholar Lawrence Langer has argued that the Kafka linkage is another instance of explanation as consolation. Establishing precedents for the unprecedented allays the puzzled conscience of a dismayed generation that still has trouble living with the unaccountability of the history of its time. Still, some of the little details and correspondences are striking. George Steiner, who, as we'll see, believes in some metaphysical sense that Kafka invented Hitler, or at least Hitler's concentration camp universe, points out, on a smaller scale, that Ungeziefer, the word Kafka used to describe the insect into which Gregor Samsa metamorphosed, is a favorite word of Hitler's, one he used to characterize the vermin of Europe, the Jews he wanted to exterminate like unwanted insects. But Binion was the first to apprise me of the very peculiar fact, meaningless except in a Kafkaesque way, that a man named Kafka once lived in Hitler's house. I have a friend who was a GI who'd been with the American occupation forces in Munich in 1946. Binion told me that afternoon. And he was visiting Hitler's apartment on Prince Regentenplatz, where Hitler lived from 1928 till he took power in Berlin in 1933, the one in which Gailey Raubel was found shot to death. And he found it occupied by a lawyer named Kafka. A coincidence, certainly, but the Hitler-Kafka connections go deeper than happenstance. Were it not for Binion's Hitler explanation and the attack on it by a descendant of Kafka, the world might never have known that the Jewish doctor who treated Hitler's mother was a relative of Franz Kafka. Is there something more to the link than these accidents of fate? It might be best to approach Binion's Kafka entanglement from the beginning. Over pasta and potato salad at Pick-a-Chick, I asked Binion if his initial interest in the Hitler question had something to do with his family background. Did he lose relatives in the camps? Having talked with him for an hour or so, I assumed by many cues that he was Jewish. He's a tall, lean, excitable Spritzer type, full of hostile, dismissive wisecracks about his academic antagonists. Philip Roth-esque, one might say. But apparently, because of the ambiguity of his name, certain of his opponents assumed Binion was not Jewish. I don't think Claude Lanzmann, who virtually called him a revisionist, knew. In fact, Binion says he's half Jewish. His father was Swiss, but my mother was Ukrainian Jewish, he told me. She had been in Austria and Germany in between wars, before coming to America. After the war, she rushed over to see her old friends as if nothing had happened. I remember her innocence, and I thought, what's wrong with her? I had seen her cry terribly, desperately, shortly after the war, when the first revelations had come out about the camps, saying, "These were my people." And then never another word, until a year before she died. She'd fallen into a cellar door, open, on a sidewalk in Brooklyn. I rushed to New York, and my mother was semi-delirious in her room, and she would say to me in a kind of hushed whisper, with terror in her eyes, when no one was within earshot, the doctors were gone, "Get me out of here. They're gassing us. They're putting us into gas ovens, and we're here to be killed. Get me out of here." And in the year afterwards, I remember, when she was back in her normal mind, and we were talking about her hospital experience, I said, "Oh, Mother, you don't know you were so far gone, you said this." And she said, "Are you telling me that your mother is mad? They were gassing us." Completely insane, Binion says. I mean, there's a little corner of insanity in which she had been traumatized. But the rest, I mean in her conscious, waking, normal condition, she had no sense of being involved in the Holocaust, even indirectly. You know, I think every Jew was hit in one way or another with this. Certainly, right then and there, Binion had been hit, but he couldn't know when he began his investigation into Hitler's metamorphosis that it would bring him back to an eerily similar tableau. A tormented, delirious mother on a sickbed, and her impressionable, traumatized son. Not Rudolf Binion, but Adolf Hitler. Accepting the challenge he found in Bradley Smith's book on Hitler's childhood, something happened to transform the likable young Adolf into the later monster. What was it? Binion began his search by immersing himself in Hitler's world, trying to get inside Hitler's head. This method of empathy would be a focus of Claude Lanzmann's attack on Binion's book. Lanzmann believes that to attempt to understand Hitler by putting oneself in Hitler's place, by in effect becoming Hitler, is a dangerous delusion that can lead ultimately to exculpation. But Binion had the courage of his convictions. He located what he believed was the key to Hitler's psyche in a cache of captured sound recordings of Hitler's speeches he'd found in the National Archives in Washington. What struck Binion most forcefully in listening to the recordings was how often Hitler articulated his hatred of Jews as hatred of the Jew. It's so strange. In the first years, he's inevitably using the singular, the Jew. I just felt there had to be a Jew. Now, at first, I thought maybe it was the guy who invented poison gas because Hitler was gassed. Then I saw a Gertrude Kurt, the analyst who'd worked on the OSS profile of Hitler for FDR. Wonderful woman. She had written an article called "The Jew and Adolf Hitler," saying, just as I did, that the Jew was a person. And look, here's this guy, Dr. Bloch, who treated his mother, and Hitler didn't know what was involved in the treatment, but obviously patients always blame the doctor unconsciously when something goes wrong. And Hitler sent Bloch loving postcards afterwards with "Yours gratefully, Adolf," and he became the protector of Dr. Bloch after the 1938 Anschluss. The peculiar relationship between Hitler and the Jewish doctor intrigued Binion. "I thought, this is something worth investigating," he told me. Benyon then did what no previous historian had done, which was to scour the archival records and interviews for details of Dr. Bloch's treatment of Hitler's mother. And finally, his eureka moment, down there in the National Archives, in the collection of Hitler papers, he found a file labeled Cassette de Hitler, private papers relating to Hitler that had been captured by the Allies. And finally, his eureka moment, down there in the National Archives, in the collection of Hitler papers, he found a file labeled Cassette de Hitler, private papers relating to Hitler that had been captured by the Allies. Inside that, he found a Hitler document no one had ever remarked on before, that no one had imagined would have survived. It was the medical case book of Dr. Eduard Bloch, with the record of his 1907 treatment of Clara Hitler. It had been procured by the Gestapo from Bloch in 1938, along with various other Hitler memorabilia, including those affectionate postcards from young Adolf, before Bloch left Linz for America. Indeed, it turned out, as a condition for Bloch getting the precious exit visa denied to almost all the other doomed Jews of Austria. The case notes on Clara Hitler were extremely hard to read, Benyon told me. It took a lot of deciphering. Was it in code or bad handwriting? I asked Benyon, little realizing I'd hit on a sore point, that this question was the occasion of the entry of Kafka into the tale. It turns out it was not his own handwriting, I think. There was a guy who was brought up by Bloch, was actually a nephew, but I think Bloch's brother died, and so he brought the kid up. And he is called now, his name is Kafka, John Kafka, a whole new person who has been persecuting me since my book came out. Persecuting you? This was the first I'd heard of the Kafka-Benyon war. Because he thinks that I blamed the Holocaust on Bloch, that he's got to deny everything that I ever said. And I was at a scholarly meeting in San Francisco, and all of a sudden this guy rose to condemn me, saying, "And furthermore, Benyon said in his book that it was Dr. Bloch's billing record, but it's not in his handwriting." Before we get further into the bitter dispute between Benyon and Kafka over Dr. Bloch's treatment of Hitler's mother, let's address the question, does Benyon blame the Holocaust on Kafka's uncle, Hitler's mother's doctor? This is how Benyon reconstructs the situation. Adolf was not yet 18 when his mother was diagnosed with breast cancer in early 1907. At the time, he was entertaining ideas of going to Vienna to become an artist. After his mother's operation in February and her apparent recovery, he did go off to Vienna, where he experienced his profoundly disappointing rejection by the Academy of Fine Arts. And then in September, when he'd heard his mother had taken a turn for the worse, he returned to Linz to consult with Dr. Bloch, who told him the tumor had recurred in the surgical wound, the cancer was spreading, and only desperate measures had a chance of saving her. Bloch proposed using iodoform, the disinfectant now mainly known as the source of hospital smell, but then hailed as a kind of panacea in the medical literature. According to Benyon, there were several things wrong with iodoform treatment for breast cancer in general. It was utterly ineffective, ruinously expensive, and the caustic solution caused unbearable agony for the patient it was administered to, usually in the form of iodoform-soaked gauze applied directly to the skin above the tumor. In addition, Benyon argues, on the basis of his deciphering of Bloch's medical casebook, the well-meaning doctor gave poor Clara extreme overdoses of the searing solution. Several decades of medical warnings were defied as iodoform gauze was packed onto the suppurating wound at an unexampled, intolerable rate, about a meter of fresh gauze containing some 5 grams of iodoform daily. Why did not Bloch, a compassionate poor folks doctor and benefactor of the indigent, kill the pain with morphine instead at small cost? for he recollected that Clara Hitler's sufferings seemed to torture her son. An anguished grimace would come over him whenever he saw pain contract her face. Why, indeed? Benyon proposes, on the basis of somewhat sketchier evidence than he's employed up to now, that Hitler himself urged the overtreatment on the doctor. He quotes Hitler's sometimes reliable friend Kubizek, recalling Hitler flaring up at the doctor's verdict that his mother's cancer was incurable. Such a Hitler, Benyon writes, would have urged upon Bloch the drastic treatment that followed. Benyon, then, finds Hitler much implicated in the horrific and disastrous course of treatment, not Dr. Bloch alone. Nonetheless, if he does not ever explicitly blame the Holocaust on this one Jewish doctor, he's certainly critical of every aspect of the treatment the doctor supervised, from the dosage to the price. And few dispute that the results of this treatment were months of unbearable agony for Hitler's mother, suffering Hitler witnessed firsthand as she approached her painful death on December 21, 1907. "I have never seen a boy so ineffably saddened," Bloch would say later. Adolf's suffering was intense and transformative, Benyon believes. Hitler's experience of his mother's last illness, Benyon concludes, looms behind his later tireless diatribes against the Jewish cancer, the Jewish poison, the Jewish profiteer. He cites telling examples from Hitler's rhetoric of the spectral presence of his mother's medical trauma. "How many diseases have their origin in the Jewish virus? The Jews are poisonous abscesses eating into the nation, an endless stream of poison being driven by a mysterious power into the outermost blood vessels of the body politic." Benyon deals with the obvious objection to this theory, Hitler's profusions of gratefulness to Bloch at the time, the singular protection he extended to Bloch when he absorbed Austria in 1938, the undying gratitude Bloch himself later described as Hitler's attitude toward him. By insisting that consciously Hitler bore Bloch no grudges, because he was both traumatized and knew himself to be implicated in the order to burn out the abscesses to the raw flesh of his mother. But while the trauma had buried his resentment at the Jewish doctor deep in his unconscious, it festered and metastasized there, Benyon insists. Abusing the Jew, in his speeches, Benyon maintains, was for Hitler a means of abusing Bloch. Murdering the Jews in the camps was the ultimate outcome. It is perhaps an oversimplification to say that Benyon blames the Holocaust on the malpractice of a Jewish country doctor, and his thesis involves more than just the Dr. Bloch episode. Another essential triggering event of the metamorphosis, Benyon believes, was Hitler's own medical trauma 10 years later, his 1918 gassing and the treatment he received from the doctor at Pasewalk. Benyon was the one who unearthed the story first circulated by Ernst Weiss, the émigré novelist and friend of Franz Kafka, that post-hypnotic suggestion by a Pasewalk nerve doctor precipitated Hitler's metamorphosis. Nonetheless, Benyon's view of Dr. Bloch's management of Hitler's mother's treatment does lend itself to a blame-the-doctor oversimplification. That was what most upset Dr. Kafka, Dr. Bloch's nephew and Benyon's implacable nemesis, when I later spoke to him. Dr. Kafka brought to my attention the advanced description of the first published form of Benyon's thesis in the History of Childhood Quarterly. In 1907, a Jewish doctor poisoned Hitler's mother while treating her for breast cancer. In 1918, Hitler was himself hospitalized from gas poisoning in the war and hallucinated a summons from on high to reverse Germany's defeat. In 1941, Hitler personally ordered removal of the Jewish cancer from the breast of Germany through the use of poison gas. 6 million Jews died as a result. However oversimplified this may sound, in the years since Benyon published his thesis, it has garnered a number of adherents, including biographer John Toland, in part, in the United States, and in Germany, the historian Eberhard Jekyll, as well as the influential psychohistorical biographer Helm Stierlin. Until Dr. Kafka materialized on Binion's case, those who objected to his theory tended to focus on the debatable persuasiveness of the unconscious dynamic of trauma Binion described, in which Hitler supposedly forced the Jews to pay the price for Dr. Bloch's prescriptions, but spared the doctor himself. But Dr. Kafka's assault on Binion focused on his analysis of the prescriptions themselves, on Binion's claim that Dr. Bloch misprescribed, overprescribed, and overcharged for the searing poison he applied to Clara Hitler's breast, and thus can be blamed for the Holocaust. I'd read some vague reference to this objection to Binion's thesis in a scholarly journal, and asked Binion about it. "That's junk," Binion told me. "This is so hopelessly stupid. No one has the patience to read through the literature as I did, but Kafka brought this up at that San Francisco meeting. And he said, 'Maybe you all think that just because he was my foster father, I'm defending him,' Bloch. But that's not true. It's because truth requires it." Now, says Binion, Kafka moves in for the kill. Arg. Kafka moves in for the kill. It should be noted at this point that the Kafka Binion refers to so casually and dismissively is not a lone obsessive amateur. Dr. John Kafka, M.D., is, in fact, a scholar in his own right, a clinical professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at the George Washington University School of Medicine, a senior training and supervising analyst at the Washington Psychoanalytic Institute, and the author of Multiple Realities in Clinical Practice, a provocative book about the way our personally meaningful realities are fluctuating and subtly diverging. The divergences in realities between Kafka and Binion are far from subtle, but Binion is not too far off, however, in his perception of Kafka's relentlessness, his implacability in pressing home at every opportunity and in every forum his attack on Binion's thesis. But when he moves in for the kill, he does so by entangling Binion in an unspeakably complicated and bizarre, indeed Kafkaesque, polemical embroilment over medical packaging, as practiced 9 decades ago in provincial Austria. Specifically, whether back in 1907, Kafka's uncle Dr. Bloch used the large economy size of iodoform gauze, and exactly how much use he made of it. Binion argues on the basis of Dr. Bloch's billing notes in his Clara Hitler file that Bloch over-applied the iodoform-soaked gauze, thus causing Clara needless torture. At that San Francisco conference, where Binion was delivering a paper and Kafka moved in for the kill, Dr. Kafka argued that while Dr. Bloch's records show purchases of 40 packages of sterile iodoform gauze, Binion is mistaken in concluding he applied all the gauze in every package to Clara's breast. Kafka is saying, in effect, he bought large economy-size packages, Binion tells me, used a little, and since he wanted the gauze to remain sterile, he would have discarded the unused balance. But the gauze is an antiseptic. It remains sterile. If you think it through, Binion says, that means he would have bought a huge package, charged odd-off for it, and snipped off a bit and thrown the rest away. Completely insane. And nobody believed that. Of course, both positions are matters of retrospective conjecture, and Binion's argument didn't get Kafka to back off. Indeed, Binion says, Kafka has taken his Binion baiting crusade international now, and is stalking not just Binion, but his scholarly allies. I recently got a letter from Eberhard Jekyll, Binion told me. Jekyll was speaking at some conference in Germany, and along came Kafka to heckle him because he was one of my supporters. And he began with this business about the iodoform and the large economy size. Binion sighs. Kafka will never give it up. I believe Binion might have lost something in translation, because the way I reconstruct the heckling of Jekyll episode, it took place at an international conference held in Frankfurt on the psychoanalytic and psychohistorical sources of anti-Semitism. Kafka was not present in person, but was represented by what I've come to call Kafka's Truth Squad, a number of psychoanalytically oriented colleagues who've joined with him in his attack on the Binyon theory of Hitler's anti-Semitism. In any case, the heckling seemed to have had an effect on Jekyll, who evidently hadn't known the ins and outs of the large economy size question, and, under fire, left the conference early. "Look, Eberhard," Binyon recalls replying to Jekyll, "it's about time you looked at the problem yourself. I spelled it out as carefully and simply as I could to him, because people lose patience." And no wonder they do. If you try to follow Binyon's simple explanation, he leads you into the thickets of his obsessively researched and calculated disquisition on the sizing and pricing of iodoform gauze packaging in 1907 Austria. "I went to the Austrian Pharmaceutical Registry, which had perfect records as far back as 1907. They sent me all the literature for that year, how much it costs, how it's sold. Iodoform gauze can be bought in 3 ways: small, medium, and large. And the larger was slightly more economical by so-and-so many centimeters. And you just cut off a little. And it's perfectly clear in all the books that you can just cut it off and then wrap the rest, and it's reused indefinitely. It's absolutely specific." In other words, Binyon is saying, Dr. Bloch used up all the iodoform gauze he charged the Hitlers for, which means, in effect, he overused, even abused it. If we now seem a bit far afield from the quest for the source of Hitler's anti-Semitic metamorphosis, this episode is typical of how frustratingly elusive the search for certainty is about any of the fragmentary pieces of evidence that underlie grand Hitler explanations, and how bitter the battle over details can be. Here, for instance, is the chart Binyon has prepared to support his assertion that Dr. Bloch was overprescribing iodoform, excerpted from a terrifyingly complicated, 4-page, single-spaced response he made to Kafka's large economy-size critique. For his protracted treatment of Clara Hitler, Bloch certainly bought the iodoform gauze in 5-meter strips, these being the most economical. The price of 5-meter strips in Austria 1907 was percent solution 10, price, Heller, 375, of which for iodoform 13.2 times 10, the rest 2.7 times 90, percent solution 20, price, Heller, 480, of which for iodoform 13.2 times 20, the rest 2.7 times 80. Percent solution 30, price Heller 580, of which for iodoform 13.2 times 30, the rest 2.7 times 70. Calculated by Ed Green, Mathematics, Brandeis. He says the figures are slightly irregular, that 580 should be 585. The price of iodoform powder, then, was 10 grams equals 90 Heller. Therefore, each application of iodoform gauze by Bloch involved solution 10%, grams of iodoform, 59 kronen 5.5, or 35 kronen 3.2, for a total cost of meters of gauze, 59 kronen 1.9, or 35 kronen 1.1. Solution 20%, grams of iodoform, 59 kronen 8.6, or 35 kronen 5.1, for a total cost of meters of gauze, 59 kronen 1.5, or 35 kronen 0.9. Solution 30%, grams of iodoform, 59 kronen 10.5, or 35 kronen 6.3, for a total cost of meters of gauze, 59 kronen 1.2, or 35 kronen 0.7. These are highest and lowest average quantities for 42 applications. The maximal cost figure of 59 kronen represents the total of the 3 akanto payments if the one for 3rd October is 15 kronen. If it is 18 kronen, then the results under 59 kronen above should be increased by some 5%. The minimal cost figure, A, excludes the akanto payment for 3rd October, the next akanto payment having been made before the iodoform treatment began, and B, counts only 15 of the 24 kronen paid akanto on 2nd December, as these 24 kronen may have been meant to last a month or 31 days, whereas the patient lived only 19 days more. It goes on and on, getting even more complex, virtually indecipherable. Still, I found myself returning again and again to gaze transfixed at the forest of figures, the cryptic hieroglyphs of century-old prescription protocols. I found myself feeling finally that there was something emblematic and tragic embodied in it, and in the heroically optimistic belief that pinning down with precision the mathematics of iodoform prescriptions will somehow bring us closer to the elusive spectral figure supposedly lurking in that thicket, the elusive truth about Hitler that has slipped away once again from yet another attempt to pin down the origin of his evil. Even Binion's allies have shied away from following him into the labyrinth of his iodoform chart. Eberhard Jekyll, a historian renowned for his ability to penetrate the veils of even the minutest of Hitler minutiae to retrieve a valuable insight, resisted following Binion this far, just wouldn't read the insanely complex chart. "Don't you see what this man Kafka is doing?" Binion wrote to Jekyll. "He's trying to create an ambiguity where there is none." So I get an answer from Jekyll saying, "Oh, I know you're right, so I can't be bothered with the details." One German researcher who did bother with the details, Ernst Günther Schenk, author of a study called Patient Hitler, has claimed that Binion might have misinterpreted some of Dr. Bloch's abbreviations for iodoform, although Schenk, too, acknowledges the difficulty of finding any certainty in disentangling and deciphering the nearly century-old details of the prescription mathematics. By this time, the relentless Dr. Kafka had, it appeared, begun to wear down even the ceaselessly combative Binion. He described to me an attempt to reach out through the Kafka family to see if he could get Dr. Kafka off his back. He appealed to George Krenn, the son of Dr. Bloch's daughter Gertrude, himself a well-known Hitler-era historian based at Kansas State University. Krenn's mother had called Binion's book about her father an international disgrace for unfairly accusing her father of malpractice that caused the Holocaust. But Krenn himself had given Binion's book a fairly positive review, one that focused on Binion's belief that the overtreatment with iodoform was Hitler's idea as much as Bloch's, that Hitler's implication in his mother's suffering was more important psychologically than the actual number of grams per yard of gauze Bloch used. Then, according to Binion, in an account that is substantially confirmed by Krenn and Kafka himself, Binion discovered that Krenn, too, had been chastised by Dr. Kafka, his own great-uncle. When Dr. Bloch's daughter Gertrude Bloch Krenn died in 1992, both George Krenn and Dr. Kafka attended the funeral. George Krenn stayed for the funeral in Trenton, New Jersey, with John Kafka, Binion told me. And he said Kafka started in on him again. He'd attacked George at that San Francisco meeting for supporting me, and George had a terrible attack of emphysema. They had to carry him out on a stretcher. Krenn recalls the emphysema, not the stretcher. We were all terribly upset about that. In any case, after the funeral, in response to Binion's plea, "George, can't you stop Kafka?" Krenn did speak with Kafka about Binion, only to report back, according to Binion, that Kafka said there's no way he'll ever stop. "He says that you have maligned his adored foster father," Krenn told Binion, "and he will get you if it takes his last dying breath." You have maligned his adored foster father. When I spoke to Dr. Kafka, I was impressed by his passion, which he argued came from more than a mere personal or familial motivation. He believes that Binion's psychoanalytic reasoning is simplistic and flawed. More important, he insists, you cannot explain the Holocaust by saying some Jew is the cause of it in one way or another. But still, something about Dr. Kafka's whole crusade recalled to me the opening lines of The Trial, in which Franz Kafka had written, "Someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K., for without having done anything wrong, he was arrested one fine morning." Somebody was spreading lies about my foster father, Dr. K. must have thought to himself, on whatever fine morning he awoke to read the Binion thesis. Someone was spreading lies that the country doctor, another Kafka title, of course, was to blame for Adolf Hitler metamorphosing into Adolf Hitler. The story of Binion's haunting by Dr. Kafka is in itself a kind of Kafkaesque parable of the danger, the consequences of too confidently trying to explain Hitler, of the way such explanation can almost inevitably involve shifting responsibility from Hitler to whoever or whatever supposedly caused his metamorphosis. In particular, it's an example of the danger of trying to trace, to pin the origin of his anti-Semitism on a hapless Jew. Binion doesn't go as far as George Steiner, who, as we'll see, not only seems willing to blame the Holocaust on Jewish ideas, he seems to want, in a more than metaphorical way, to blame it and Hitler on the power of Franz Kafka's imagination. But Binion's Hitler explanation has become the symbolic focus, even the scapegoat, for a radical reaction against, a rejection of, the whole project of explanation itself, a rejection embodied in Claude Lanzmann's fervent denunciation of the obscenity of the very project of understanding. Chapter 14. Claude Lanzmann and the War Against the Question Why, in which the director of Shoah tries to silence a Holocaust survivor who fails to understand his film. It was a moment of high drama. It left some who witnessed it stunned and angry. It was perhaps the signature moment in Claude Lanzmann's ferocious campaign against Hitler explanation, his crusade to silence the question why. It was a moment in which Lanzmann, the maker of Shoah, the highly respected 9.5-hour Holocaust documentary, turned on a Holocaust survivor, a man who had endured 2 years in Auschwitz, because the survivor had dared violate one of Lanzmann's commandments about how one should and should not speak about the death camps. Some who witnessed it found Lanzmann's attack, his successful attempt to suppress the discussion the frail and gentle septuagenarian survivor wanted to have about certain troubling questions that arose from his Auschwitz experience, shocking. One of those present spoke up and compared Lanzmann's behavior to that of Nazi book burners. And 4 years after the attack, the target, the Auschwitz survivor, Dr. Louis Michaels, still sounded shaken when he spoke about it to me. He called the filmmaker's behavior totalitarian. A strong term, but one that perhaps should not come as a complete surprise to those familiar with Lanzmann's position on the question. Because his central commandment, the one he enforced so harshly against Dr. Michaels, his imperious "thou shalt not ask why," is one Lanzmann has proudly adapted from a Primo Levi story about an SS guard at Auschwitz, a man who told Levi, "There is no why here." Many will be surprised at how extreme Lanzmann has become in his holy war against the explainers, at the way he'll call their work obscene, even revisionist, linking the Hitler explainers with Holocaust deniers. Lanzmann is a man deservedly much honored, even revered, by many for whom Shoah was the primary, even the defining evocation of this greatest of all human tragedies. To many he is a sage, even a prophet or holy man, for having been the medium of transmission of a powerful, horrifying truth. To some, however, particularly among post-structuralist American and French academics, in the thrall of the theories and jargon of Jacques Lacan, he has become the center of what amounts to a literary theorist's Holocaust cult, academics whose response to Lanzmann's film is to celebrate it for embodying post-structuralist theoretical fetishes such as open signs and mimesis of representation in his footage of death camp witnesses. Consider the introductory description of Lanzmann by one of his chief academic acolytes, a paean delivered on the very evening Lanzmann succeeded in suppressing the voice of the Auschwitz survivor. Shoah was described by critics immediately upon its appearance as the film event of the century. We know today that it is more than the film event of the century, because it is not simply a film, but a truly revolutionary artistic and cultural event. One of the things that has been most frequently remarked upon, especially in Europe, about the film Shoah, is the amazing psychoanalytic presence of Claude Lanzmann on the screen, a presence tangible both in the depth of his silence and in the efficacy of his speech, in the success of his interventions in bringing forth the truth. I thought Shoah an impressive achievement when I saw it, although there were some aspects of it, Lanzmann's unquestioning adoption, for instance, of the point of view of an inmate witness who survived by keeping fellow Jews about to be murdered in the dark, that raised questions in my mind about his judgment. I was not aware until I began researching the literature that had arisen around Lanzmann and Shoah in the aftermath of its 1985 release, how the film had raised him to the Vedic, prophetic heights from which he now hurls thunderbolts at those who violate his commandments. It is not an exaggeration to call them commandments. Lanzmann uses explicitly Sinai-like rhetoric to articulate the rules for all who dare to discuss his subject. Consider the words he used in his published attack on Steven Spielberg's film Schindler's List. After Shoah, certain things can no longer be done. When I first heard that line, I was sure there had been a mistake. A researcher was reading to me over the phone a translation of the version of Lanzmann's attack on Spielberg that appeared in the Parisian daily Le Monde on March 3, 1994. "You mean he's saying after the Shoah, certain things are forbidden?" I said, thinking Lanzmann might have been echoing Theodor Adorno's famous remark that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. "No," my researcher insisted. "Lanzmann is saying that after Shoah, after his film, certain things are forbidden." The most severe of the many strictures Lanzmann issued against Spielberg's film was the forbidden crime of creating a false archive that he had transgressed by attempting to recreate scenes within the concentration camps, because any attempt at representation inevitably falsified the reality. Finding a true path through Lanzmann's commandments about recreation and representation is tricky. He, for instance, in order to provoke a sobbing breakdown on the part of his key death camp witness, the Jewish barber in Treblinka, had rented a barber shop and instructed the reluctant ex-barber to pretend to be practicing a trade he'd long abandoned, to clip hair in order to force him to confront the barbering he'd done at Treblinka, shaving the heads of thousands of women before they were gassed. Lanzmann is proud of that representational recreation, but on the other hand, he is equally proud of his own rejection of genuine archival footage. Not only did he refuse to use any actual film footage or still photographs of the death camps in Shoah, footage of the sort that Alain Resnais used with devastating effectiveness in his Night and Fog, for instance, Lanzmann made it a moral principle that such film was inferior to his method of reconstruction. Talking head interviews between Lanzmann and survivor witnesses, which gives him more screen time in Shoah than any of the survivors, makes him the hero of memory, makes him the amazing presence to replace the absent images of real victims he's forbidden and banished. But Lanzmann goes further. In his attack on Spielberg and in conversation with me, he insisted that if he ever found a secretly made film that shows the actual killing of 3,000 Jews in a death camp, say, Not only would he refuse to use it, but he would seek to destroy it. There certainly are arguments to be made on both sides of these questions, but for Landsman, after Shoah, there is no argument. Certain matters are settled. Certain things are forbidden. His film is not merely superior to reality. It replaces, substitutes for, and demands the literal destruction of the merely real. Of course, Landsman is not alone in his impulse to make post-Holocaust commandments. Emil Fackenheim offered one: "Thou shalt not grant Hitler any posthumous victories." But Fackenheim has the humility not to insist that after his book further discussion is forbidden, nor has he forbidden actual survivors from raising questions about their experiences, as Landsman did when he used his celebrity power to silence Auschwitz survivor Dr. Louis Michaels in a humiliating public attack. It was in preparation for a scheduled interview with Landsman in Paris that I came upon some disturbing transcripts and memoirs of that episode, which occurred on the night of April 11, 1990, at Yale's Becton Engineering Laboratory Auditorium, before an audience of 1 to 200 academics and psychoanalysts. After immersing myself in it, I found myself forced to ask the forbidden why about Landsman. What could possibly explain his behavior that evening? Before describing my tense encounter with the sage in Paris, some further background is appropriate. To begin with, Landsman was a latecomer to Jewish identity. According to the laudatory introduction at Yale by his admiring acolyte, Claude Landsman was born in Paris to a Jewish family that had cut its ties with the Jewish world. During the Second World War, he was a student resistance leader in France, organizing at the age of 17 his fellow high school students as a resistance group against the Nazis. There is something of the zeal of the late convert in his behavior. One observer of the crusades Landsman and his circle have pursued so relentlessly against those who violate the commandment against asking why suggested that the late conversion phenomenon might be responsible for the fanaticism of the cult surrounding him as well. Many of them are Lacanian psychoanalysts who have lionized Landsman, having themselves only come to Jewish identification through Shoah. Again, not through the Shoah, but through Landsman's film about it. One source of the fanaticism on the question is the combative style of the engagé French intellectual. Landsman rose in that world by serving first as private secretary to Jean-Paul Sartre, and then later as lover of Sartre's one-time great love, Simone de Beauvoir, who anointed him editor of Les Temps Modernes, a position equivalent to that of Pope of post-existentialist, post-structuralist Parisian intellectuals, one that encouraged the issuance of intellectual papal bulls and prescriptions. The style calls for a kind of moralizing, even criminalizing rhetoric of ethical and aesthetic matters. My favorite example of Landsman's edicts in this respect is his reply to a questioner at a seminar at Yale about the crime of certain camera angles. "I wanted to show the village of Chelmno, and the cameraman told me there is only one way, by helicopter. I said, never. There were no helicopters for the Jews when they were locked in the church or in the castle. This would have been a crime, a moral and artistic crime." Maybe yes, maybe no. One wonders if the dead of Chelmno would be as exercised as Landsman on this helicopter shots issue, or as appreciative as his self-congratulatory tone suggests they should be. Still, the zeal of the convert and the arrogance of the Parisian intellectual are not sufficient to explain Landsman's rage, the violence of his attack on the idea of explanation. Certainly, the 11-year ordeal of making Shoah, of living with the horror as he did, helps make the passion he brings to these questions understandable. Once, in the course of researching a story on the bitter controversies over the origin and meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the potentially momentous implications their decipherment might have for both Judaism and Christianity, a prominent Scrolls scholar, the head of the Princeton Theological Seminary Dead Sea Scrolls publication project, began ticking off for me a casualty list of some of the most brilliant of the scroll scholars, men who had been driven to madness, drink, religious conversion, suicide, and heretical visions by the long years they'd spent trying to piece together some meaning from the hellish jigsaw puzzle of the fragmentary scraps of scrolls that remained to be linked up. The attempt to find some ultimate lost revelation, perhaps the very fingerprints of God in these tattered scraps of ancient parchment, drove all too many over the edge. It's surprising it hasn't happened more often among those like Landsman, trying to piece together the truth about the nature of ultimate evil from the fragmentary scraps of evidence that are our only clues. But what's surprising about Landsman's post-Shoah crusade is not the passion of his own views, but the violence of his attack against views of others. It's not enough to refute their logic or question their assumptions. They must be hounded into silence or oblivion, branded as guilty of virtual complicity in the Holocaust. Consider the way Landsman virtually branded Rudolf Binion of Brandeis, the son of a Jewish mother, as a revisionist, a Holocaust-denying Nazi sympathizer. As editor of Le Temps Moderne, it wasn't enough for Landsman to publish an acolyte's vituperative assault on Binion's book Hitler Among the Germans, an attack that nearly caused cancellation of a planned French edition of the book. But Landsman could not resist putting a blood-red banner across the otherwise sedate cover of that issue for a promotional blurb. Rudolf Binion and Adolf Hitler, Psychohistory as Fig Leaf for Revisionism? Binion believes the misspelling of his first name as Rudolf, with an F, rather than Rudolph, with a PH, was a sly covert effort to make it conform visually with Adolf. Whatever the case, the overt content of the promotional blurb is an assault in itself, in asking whether Binion's Hitler explanation is a fig leaf for revisionism. Landsman comes very close to branding Binion himself as a revisionist, the clear implication being that his work is a deliberate attempt not merely to explain, but to exonerate Hitler. Indeed, Landsman's belief is that all explanation is, de facto, exoneration. But he can't resist the imputation that, in Binion's case, the explainer's thinly veiled goal is the same as that of neo-Nazi Holocaust deniers. Binion told me he took Landsman to court in France for the revisionist slur, but that after winning a preliminary judgment that he was entitled to a full-scale trial, he had to drop the suit because he couldn't afford to pursue it on his Brandeis professor's salary. Revisionist is a strong word to use, I said to Landsman in the course of our encounter in his Paris office. I don't know if it's a strong word, he said, but the ruling enterprise of Binion is obscene. Why obscene? Because he believes you can explain it. Obscenity. It is the epithet of choice for Landsman and his devotees when attacking those who ask the question, why? Binion doesn't shrink from formulating the question, why did they kill the Jews? Writes Sabine Prochorus, the author of the article heralded by the Fig Leaf for Revisionism blurb. The obscenity of this question is stressed by Claude Landsman, she says, as if that settles the matter all by itself. But obscenity only begins to limn the rhetoric of abuse that the Landsmanites heap on those such as Binion, who ask the question why. Consider this partial catalogue of insults that Prochorus heaps on Binion and his work. Confounding stupidity, epistemological monster, bizarre, despicable, active ignorance, destruction of thought, scandalous, perversity, de facto justification of the Holocaust, his, Binion's, hero Hitler, annihilated history, destroyed psychology, fascist discourse, poisonous imposture. This catalogue of abuse, used to support the familiar Landsman argument that to attempt to explain Hitler psychologically is to empathize and excuse him, builds to a final vicious thrust. Binion is guilty, Prochorus claims, of using explicatory method as final solution, a charge that goes beyond calling Binion revisionist or an apologist for Hitler. It is tantamount to identifying Binion as Hitler, both of them executors of a horrific final solution, with Binion as what Prochorus calls, in a final epithet, a paper Eichmann.